Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Beauty is a weird thing in humans. We've all seen beautiful people in our lifetimes, yet we can't quite agree on what features make a person beautiful. In fact, generation after generation of people redefine beauty standards based on certain features they find desirable. So it's an extremely arbitrary thing that shouldn't have any relevance, except that it does. According to studies, beautiful people are perceived as more competent, sociable, and trustworthy. It offers them certain advantages in terms of job opportunities and relationship opportunities. So one would certainly think that this would make them happier than the common folk. But alas, this is not always the case. You thought if you changed your face, something would happen. You had nothing, and yet you blame that on your face. Now look at my face. Susumu Nakoshi, the main protagonist of Homunculus, is a man who lived his whole life in dread because of the way he looked. It paralyzed him from interacting with others, so he kept his head down and pretended as though he didn't exist. Non-existence, for him, was preferable to looking ugly. Eventually though, he decided to alter his disposition in life by having reconstructive surgery to make him more beautiful, to make him better than the common folk. But as we can see here in this manga panel, it didn't have the desired effect. His problems were not on the physical level like he thought, but rather they were on the internal level, the unconscious level as it were. And oh boy, were these problems quite severe. It isn't about the face, it isn't about the money, it isn't about the cars. I am not an invisible man. I am not Zero. Look at me. Unable to deal with the hollow life that he created for himself, Nakoshi voluntarily chose to be homeless. Well, not completely homeless. He decided to keep his car so that he didn't have to live in a tent like the rest of them. And this is a reoccurring theme with Nakoshi in the manga. He actively creates artificial barriers between himself and others. He's afraid of the acceptance of others, but more to the point, he's afraid of accepting himself. Now, without a job to make money, his funds became scarce pretty fast. So he eventually agreed to have an elective surgery, a surgery that would drill a hole into his skull. Manabu, a medical student, called the procedure trepanation, and according to him, it opens up a person's sixth sense. And sure enough, upon receiving the surgery, Nakoshi starts seeing humans in a whole different light. He sees their quote-unquote homunculi, their bodies transform based on their own deficiencies. For example, a Yakuza boss who accidentally cut off the pinky of his friend is encased in a mecha suit to hide from the guilt that he feels. And it isn't until he admits to his own guilt and cuts off his own pinky that he can finally move on. And we know that he's moved on because the suit of armor that was once there that shielded his body disappeared afterwards. And he was able to go through this transformational experience because of Nakoshi. Nakoshi dragged out his shadow from the depths and brought it to the light of day, helping him heal psychologically. But despite having this profound effect on the Yakuza boss, we find out as the reader that Nakoshi has learned nothing from this experience, and that he himself had a similar experience with a friend in which he pushed him and that friend got ran over by a car. And because he could not confront this issue himself, he finds that he has a robotic appendage on his arm. And from a psychological perspective, I think it's obvious what's happening here. When we look at others in society, we see reflections of ourselves. If you remember, when Nakoshi gains his new abilities, only half of the people that he sees are distorted or malformed. The other half are completely fine. The reason Nakoshi sees malformations in certain people is because he possesses a similar malformation within his psyche. He's projecting his own psychological disturbances onto people that have similar afflictions. Because he went through a similar situation as the Yakuza boss, he feels a similar level of guilt, which is why he was able to commiserate with him. Unfortunately, through this commiseration, he disassociated himself. He took himself out of the experience and didn't recognize the own deficiency within himself. He couldn't admit to his own level of guilt or regret, as he was more content with pretending as though it never happened. In fact, he even laughed at the mafia boss for being so pathetic. We could even surmise that he was laughing at himself for not confronting his own fears. Almost everything narcissists say and do is intended to avoid the experience of shame. The narcissistic defenses they mobilize against shame are so extreme and pervasive that they color everything about the person's personality, relationships, and behavior, creating a kind of shell or armor against the threat of shame. Now, evading his own internal issues have severe consequences. They don't just simply go away, they linger deep down within our souls, and they can come out in the most heinous ways possible, or they can rot you from the inside out. Now, when he elected to have cosmetic surgery to make an improvement on his physical appearance, he completely changed himself into a perfect mass of symbols. He based his entire existence on money, cars, exquisite food, and beautiful women. His head was no longer down like the old days when he was ugly. That being said, he was no closer to creating meaningful connections with actual people. Just like the robotic arm, he was using symbols to create yet another barrier from others, a cloak so that no one could ever get close to him. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask. Designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other hand, to conceal the true nature of the individual. A healthy and well-balanced persona is necessary to adapt to society's demands. However, a persona that's too powerful makes one lose sight of themselves. In this sense, a person becomes a husk, a social puppet at the expense of their individuality. And we have to ask ourselves, at what point does the mask of the persona become stuck on the individual? One may even get disillusioned with thoughts that the persona is the true self. Now, there's a point in the manga where Nakoshi forgets what he looks like prior to the cosmetic surgery. Symbolically, he's become disassociated from his true self, which means that he no longer remembers who he is. In fact, if he were to see his true self, it would appear as an alien to him, an entity so foreign and demonic that he would run away from it in earnest. During a particularly interesting conversation, Nakoshi sees a shadow version of himself when talking to Manabu. Now, both men have concealed their true selves from society, and thus have become divorced from their true selves. Confronted with someone so familiar to his true self, Nakoshi becomes anxious and disturbed. The pressure simply overwhelms him to the point that he's forced to take drastic actions. And he does this by cutting the sutures on his right eye, bringing him back to quote-unquote reality. Now, what I failed to mention earlier on was that Nakoshi can only see people's true forms, homunculi, when he covers his right eye. Now, the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere of the brain, and the left hemisphere of the brain is associated with logic and reason. This is the side that fosters the ego consciousness and the persona, whereas the right side is the imaginative side. This is the side that's creative and hosts the shadow, the unconsciousness. Nakoshi was fully embracing the right side of his brain, i.e. the left eye, because he's solely focused on other people's problems, which were, in effect, his problems. But he didn't acknowledge that they were his problems, and because he didn't acknowledge it, everything was fine. He could live in his make-believe world and be happy, helping others overcome their deficiencies while neglecting his own. Whether they show it or even realize it themselves, narcissists are always in flight from pain. Narcissism is an egocentric kind of self-love with a general lack of empathy towards others. It's a destructive disorder that propels them to project their many insecurities and shortcomings onto others. Nakoshi uses homunculi to redirect his own defects. He can't personally acknowledge what ails him, so he craves to find someone with the same problems. But he's not searching them out because he cares about their feelings or needs. Rather, he does it for his own self-aggrandizement. This leads him to overlook important people and events in his life because he's overly focused on his own needs. Prior to his surgery, he felt like an invisible man, so he attempted to compensate for his outward appearance by studying hard and working out relentlessly. He's empty on the inside. He's below me. Stop looking at that empty fool. Look at me. Nakoshi attempted to fill up his insides so that people would look past his appearance. He even took up bulimia so that everything below his head looked immaculate. Narcissists rely heavily on external approval, hence the reason Nakoshi goes to great lengths to be exceptional in everything he does. It's all a means to elicit acknowledgement and recognition from others. His constant need for validation and acceptance propels him to adopt a malformed personality. The reason that he constantly sees a blank face on Nanako is because she understands the act that he's putting on. Nakoshi calls others empty fools because he himself is devoid of character. He made his metaphorical face malleable to adapt to any situation. However, it was dearth of authenticity. He was a calculating machine, and he sought to extract the most amount of value out of any given situation. Emotions and feelings were mere externalities in his equation. He destroyed companies and livelihoods in his day job, and destroyed his personality in his nightly escapades. But he knew something was not right. Deep down, something rattled him to his core. He'd eat his own cum and spray it all over women's faces to remind himself that he was still a human. He could not create anything of his own value, and so he was a nothing, even though he constantly pressed up against this. And it was not long before all this simple pleasure became dull and mundane. His apathy zapped away any enjoyment, until he finally spent his days lost in thought. I am a recovering narcissist. I thought narcissism was about self-love, till someone told me there was a flip side to it. It's actually drearier than self-love. It's unrequited self-love. Ironic that a narcissist should desperately seek admiration and acceptance, but they find themselves loathsome. Nakoshi is aware on some level that what he projects on the outside world is not the real him. He's a master at concealing his self-contempt, and he does this by finding people whom he can project his own problems onto. Hence the reason he becomes increasingly addicted to drilling holes into his skull so that he can see other people's homunculi. When I look at narcissism through the vulnerability lens, I see the shame-based fear of being ordinary. I see the fear of never feeling extraordinary enough to be noticed, to be lovable, to belong, or to cultivate a sense of purpose. Nanako was the only person that found endearing qualities in Nakoshi, the only one that noticed him, the only one that accepted him. His face was pressed into hers because she wanted him in her life. She created a space for him and found purpose through him. Someone finally gave him exactly what he desired, and yet he ran away from it. For someone who wanted to be accepted for the real him, he rejected Nanako's unconditional love. He chose superficial beauty as opposed to genuine affection. What's more, he abandoned the baby they created together for his own vanity. The vain. We are like shop windows, in which we are continually arranging, concealing, or illuminating the supposed qualities that others ascribe to us, in order to deceive ourselves. In the latter parts of the manga, Nakoshi starts seeing his own image in numerous reflective objects. This is a metaphor for the persona that he created. He reflects the image he wants others to see, but as a reflection, he is a non-entity. He exists in a sense, but in actuality, he doesn't. It's quite apt that Nanako saw him as a cloud. Not because he's some pure angelic being, it's because he's formless. He could be anything, but at the same time, he's nothing. And like a cloud, he was so far from the surface of reality that he appeared as an abstraction. No man can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude without finally getting bewildered as to which may be true. Nakoshi looked beyond Nanako's eyes, beyond the truth, to a field of lies. He embraced the lies, he embraced the fake world. But the truth remained hardwired into his psyche. No amount of surgery or selective amnesia would ever remove that fact. So his self-prescribed answer to this? You won't need to cover your heart with lies anymore. Not to people, not to me, you won't need to lie anymore. You just have to lie a little to yourself. Nakoshi split his psyche into two halves. There was the persona, the idealized version of himself, and the shadow version, the truth. The place where he buried all his fears, regrets, and sorrows. It was the place that he desperately tried to forget. He, quote-unquote, reconciled his issues by exorcising the demons in others. And in this way, he vicariously went through the process of shadow integration. Now, shadow integration is the process in which you acknowledge the uncomfortable and repressed aspects of yourself so that you may become more complete, so that you may become more of who you truly are. But vicariously experiencing shadow integration, like Nakoshi was doing, is not the same as having a genuine experience. He helped people with their problems, sure, but he did it from a perspective of self-interest. It was all a means to inflate his own ego and make himself feel more special. It's ironic though, because his body knew exactly what was going on with him. His unconscious knew that there was several demons in his closet, and yet he was unwilling to acknowledge them as his demons. And this is why by the very end of the manga, everyone starts looking like him. Every major decision that he made in his life was for him and him alone. His quote-unquote truth was that he was the only one that mattered. He never saw any other person's heart. He merely saw his heart reflected on other people. Look at me, I'll look at you. Nakoshi, throughout the manga, but particularly at the end, engaged in what psychologists refer to as magical thinking. It's a distorted way of thinking that allows narcissists to perceive themselves as perfect and flawless. Nakoshi truly believed he had a profound understanding on what other people's hearts looked like. So much so that he wanted to share his quote-unquote gift with other people. And this type of thinking got Nanako killed, as she likely died from a hematoma due to the trepanation operation. And because narcissists lack empathy, their moral compass becomes distorted. This is why Nakoshi can rape a teenage girl and kill his lover without any feelings of remorse. And this brings us back to the first image of the manga. It's actually an image that's repeated time and time again. That of Nakoshi in the fetal position, sucking on his thumb. Now this is the typical manner in which a baby or child sleeps. And from a psychoanalytical perspective, children are narcissists. But it's a normal developmental stage, it's not anything to worry about. And with a good support structure and parents, they eventually grow out of this. Well, most do at least. Some people, like Nakoshi, are stuck in this early psychological stage, and they never truly break out of it. And this was the reason that the mangaka drew him in this sleeping position. It was to show that psychologically this is where he was at. He was a narcissistic child posing as an adult. And because of this disposition, it led to a full-blown psychosis by the end of the manga. No matter how socially skilled an extreme narcissist is, he has a major attachment dysfunction. The extreme narcissist is frozen in childhood.